Tonight, someone listening to this message is carrying a burden nobody else can see. Someone is fighting battles behind closed doors. There are people who feel surrounded by attacks, broken by betrayal, wounded by words, and exhausted by spiritual warfare. But hear me clearly, God did not bring you here to be defeated. He brought you here for victory. In Psalm 1:9, we find a cry from a man under attack, hated without cause, surrounded by enemies, misunderstood and wounded. Yet instead of surrendering to fear, he lifted his voice to heaven. And when he prayed, God moved with power. There are curses spoken over people today, curses of fear, failure, addiction, poverty, depression, confusion, and hopelessness. The enemy wants you to believe that your situation will never change, but the devil is a liar. The God we serve is still breaking chains, still opening doors, still delivering his people, and still crushing every attack of the enemy. This message is not about revenge. It is about restoration. It is about standing in the authority of God and declaring that no weapon formed against you shall prosper. It is about learning how prayer can break strongholds, silence fear, and release heaven's power into your life. So wherever you are right now, in your home, your car, your workplace, or lying awake in the middle of the night, I want you to open your heart. Because before this message is over, I believe God is going to give somebody peace where there was torment, strength where there was weakness, and victory where there was defeat. There are battles in life that nobody sees. Some people walk into a room smiling while carrying pain that words cannot describe. They shake hands, go to work, sit in church, and speak kindly to others, yet deep inside they are fighting storms that never seem to end. Hidden battles are often the hardest battles because the world only notices outward appearances, but God sees the tears that fall in secret. He sees the sleepless nights, the anxious thoughts, the silent fears, and the heavy burdens carried in the heart. Many people today are wounded by betrayal. They trusted someone who broke their confidence, lied to them, or turned against them. The pain of betrayal cuts deeply because it often comes from people closest to us. A stranger cannot hurt you the way a trusted friend can. Some are carrying scars from words spoken years ago. Words from parents, teachers, spouses, or enemies that planted fear and insecurity deep inside the soul. The enemy loves to use words as weapons because he knows that what enters the mind can affect the entire direction of a person's life. Others are fighting hidden battles in their homes. There are husbands and wives smiling in public while their marriage is falling apart in private. There are parents crying in secret over children who have lost their way. There are young people pretending to be strong while depression slowly drains the joy out of their lives. Some people are battling NG addiction and feel trapped in chains they cannot break. Every day they promise themselves they will change, yet every night they find themselves falling into the same struggle again. The shame becomes heavier with every failure. There are also spiritual battles taking place that many people do not recognize. The enemy attacks minds with fear, confusion, temptation, and hopelessness. He whispers lies into hearts saying, "You are too broken, you are too weak, God has forgotten you." But those lies are not from God. The devil wants people to stay trapped in darkness because he fears what God can do through a life fully surrendered to him. The enemy attacks people hardest when breakthrough is near. When God is preparing to lift someone higher, opposition often increases. That is why many believers feel pressure on every side. Yet pressure does not mean God has abandoned you. Sometimes pressure is proof that heaven is preparing you for victory. In Psalm 1:9, we see the cry of a man surrounded by attacks and false accusations. He was hated without reason and spoken against by wicked people. Yet instead of giving up, he brought his pain before God. That is the difference between defeat and victory. Broken people often run away from God when they should run toward him. Prayer becomes powerful when it comes from a desperate heart. God listens when his children cry out honestly before him. Some people listening today are exhausted because they have been fighting too long by themselves. They have tried to solve every problem with their own strength. They trusted money, relationships, or human solutions, but nothing brought lasting peace. The truth is that some battles cannot be won with human power alone. Spiritual battles require spiritual strength. Fear cannot cast out fear. Darkness cannot remove darkness. Only the power of God can break chains that have held people captive for years. The hidden battles people fight every day are not always visible, but their effect can be devastating. Anxiety steals sleep, worry steals peace, bitterness steals joy, anger destroys relationships, guilt crushes confidence. Many people are alive physically but exhausted emotionally and spiritually. Yet even in the middle of pain, God remains faithful. The Lord specializes in restoring wounded hearts. He brings peace into chaos and light into darkness. He takes people who feel forgotten and reminds them that they are deeply loved by Him. God has not called His people to live in constant fear. He has called them to stand in faith. Faith does not mean problems disappear overnight, but it means trusting that God is greater than every problem. The enemy may attack, but he does not have the final word. God always has the final word. Every giant eventually falls. Every storm eventually passes. Every chain can be broken through the power of Jesus Christ. There are people who feel weak right now because life has drained them emotionally. They have cried so much that no tears remain. But God sees every hidden struggle. He hears every silent prayer. Even when nobody else understands the battle, heaven understands. The Lord walks beside His people in every dark valley. He does not abandon them in seasons of pain. Sometimes the greatest miracles begin in the darkest moments of life. The hidden battles people fight every day may remain unseen by the world, but they are never unseen by God. He knows every fear, every burden, every wound, and every attack. And through His power, victory is still possible for those who trust Him. Prayer is one of the greatest weapons God has given to His people. Many people see prayer as a religious habit, but true prayer is far more powerful than words spoken out of routine. Prayer is communication with the living God. It is where weakness meets divine strength. It is where fear meets faith. It is where broken hearts encounter the healing power of heaven. Throughout history, prayer has changed lives, opened impossible doors, defeated enemies, and brought victory in moments when all hope seemed lost. In Psalm 109, we see a man crying out to God while surrounded by attacks, betrayal, and hatred. He was falsely accused and spoken against by wicked people. His enemies tried to destroy him with lies and cruelty. Yet instead of remaining silent, he turned to prayer. That is one of the greatest lessons believers can learn. When attacks come, prayer must become the first response instead of the last option. Too many people panic before they pray. They worry before they worship. They run to everyone else before they run to God. But real power is released when people fall on their knees and seek the Lord with sincerity. Prayer has power because God has power. The strength of prayer does not come from human words alone. It comes from the one who hears those words. When believers pray, they are not speaking into emptiness. They are speaking to the Creator of heaven and earth. The God who parted the Red Sea, shut mouths of lions, raised the dead, and defeated giants is still listening to the prayers of His people today. Nothing is too difficult for Him. Many people underestimate what can happen through one sincere prayer. A single prayer can break years of fear. One moment in God's presence can heal wounds carried for decades. Prayer can restore peace to a troubled mind and strength to a weary soul. It can bring wisdom during confusion and comfort during sorrow. Even when circumstances do not change immediately, prayer changes the heart of the person praying. It builds faith, renews hope, and reminds believers that they are not fighting alone. The enemy works hard to keep people from praying because he knows the power prayer carries. Distractions increase when people try to seek God. Doubts enter the mind. Weariness takes over. Some people stop praying because they feel their prayers are not being answered quickly enough. But delay does not mean denial. God hears every prayer, even when answers. Words are not immediate. Sometimes heaven is working behind the scenes in ways human eyes cannot yet see. Faith means trusting God even when results are delayed. Prayer is also an act of surrender. It is admitting that human strength alone is not enough. Pride tells people to handle everything by themselves, but humility brings people into the presence of God. Some battles in life are too great for human ability. Fear, addiction, bitterness, depression, and spiritual oppression cannot always be overcome through willpower alone. That is why people need the power of God operating in their lives. Prayer invites that power into every situation. There are moments when prayer becomes the lifeline that keeps a person standing. In seasons of heartbreak, prayer provides comfort. In moments of temptation, prayer provides strength. During attacks from enemies, prayer becomes protection. Some of the strongest believers in history were not people without struggles. They were people who learned how to pray through struggles. They discovered that God gives peace even in the middle of storms. Prayer also reveals the condition of the heart. Honest prayer strips away pride and pretension. God is not impressed by empty religious speeches. He responds to sincere hearts. Some of the most powerful prayers ever spoken were simple cries for help. A desperate prayer from a broken person can move heaven. God listens to those who seek Him with humility and faith. The power of prayer is not limited by location, education, wealth, or status. A person can pray in a church, in a prison cell, in a hospital room, or alone in the middle of the night. God hears prayers from every corner of the earth. Some people feel unworthy to pray because of past mistakes, but God invites broken people to come to Him. No life is too damaged for His mercy. No situation is beyond His ability to restore. Prayer strengthens believers against spiritual attacks. The enemy tries to weaken faith through fear and discouragement, but prayer renews spiritual strength. It reminds believers that God is greater than every enemy they face. Darkness cannot overcome the light of God's presence. Chains begin to break when people pray with faith and persistence. In difficult seasons, prayer keeps hope alive. Even when answers seem far away, prayer reminds people that God is still in control. The storms of life may rage, enemies may rise, and trials may increase, but the power of God remains unchanged. Those who learn to pray discover that victory does not come from human ability alone. It comes from trusting the Lord who never fails His people. Many people live under burdens they cannot fully explain. They try to move forward in life, yet something always seems to pull them backward. Fear follows them everywhere they go. Failure repeats itself again and again. Families remain trapped in cycles of anger, addiction, poverty, confusion, and hopelessness. Some begin to believe that this pain is simply their destiny. In why? But God never created His people to live in bondage. Through faith in Him, chains can be broken, darkness can be defeated, and every curse can lose its power. In the Bible, a curse represents anything that brings destruction, oppression, separation from God, or continual defeat into a person's life. Sometimes curses are spoken through hateful words. Sometimes they are created through sin, bitterness, rebellion, or generations of brokenness passed down from one family to another. The enemy wants people trapped in fear because fear weakens faith. He wants people to believe they will never change, never heal, and never rise above their struggles. But the power of God is greater than every curse the enemy tries to place upon a life. Faith is the key that opens the door to freedom. Faith is not pretending problems do not exist. Faith is believing that God is stronger than those problems. It is trusting God even when circumstances appear impossible. In Psalm 1:9, we see a man surrounded by attacks, hatred, and false accusations. Enemies spoke against him and tried to destroy him, yet he turned to God instead of surrendering to despair. That is what faith does. Faith refuses to give fear the final word. Some people are carrying curses of fear. Fear controls their decisions, steals their peace, and keeps them trapped in anxiety. They worry constantly about tomorrow. They fear failure, rejection, sickness, and uncertainty. But fear does not come from God. The Lord calls His people to walk by faith, not by fear. Faith reminds believers that God remains in control even when life feels unstable. When faith grows stronger, fear begins to lose its grip. Others are carrying curses of bitterness and unforgiveness. Pain from the past has poisoned their hearts. They replay old wounds over and over in their minds. The enemy uses unforgiveness like a prison cell, keeping people trapped in anger and resentment. But faith releases healing. Faith trusts God enough to let go of reason, venge, and leave justice in His hands. Forgiveness does not mean the pain was acceptable. It means refusing to let that pain control the future. Some people feel trapped in cycles of addiction and destructive habits. They have tried to break free many times but continue falling into the same patterns. Shame tells them they are too weak to change. The enemy whispers that freedom is impossible. but God specializes in setting captives free. Through faith, chains that seemed unbreakable can shatter. God can restore minds damaged by addiction, heal hearts broken by sin, and give strength to people who feel powerless. There are also curses of hopelessness that attack the minds of many people today. Some wake up every morning already expecting disappointment. They have suffered so long that they no longer believe life can improve. But hopelessness is one of the enemy's greatest lies. As long as God is alive, hope is alive. The Lord can open doors no human being can shut. He can bring restoration to situations that appear completely dead. Faith sees possibilities where others only see defeat. Breaking curses through faith also requires surrender. Many people want freedom without change. They want victory while still holding on to habits, attitudes, and sins that keep them bound. True faith means trusting God enough to obey Him. It means allowing Him to transform the heart. God does not simply remove chains, He creates new lives. He replaces fear with peace, hatred with love, confusion with wisdom, and despair with hope. The enemy fights hardest against people who are close to breakthrough. That is why some believers experience intense spiritual attacks when they begin drawing closer to God. Darkness fears the power of a life fully surrendered to the Lord. But believers must remember that attacks do not mean God has abandoned them. Sometimes attacks are proof that the enemy is threatened by what God is about to do. Faith grows stronger through prayer, worship, and the Word of God. The more people fill their hearts with truth, the weaker the lies of the enemy become. Curses lose power when believers stand on God's promises instead of listening to fear. Victory begins in the mind before it appears in circumstances. When people believe God is able, they begin walking differently, praying differently, and living differently. There is no curse stronger than the power of God. No darkness can overcome His light. No chain is beyond His ability to break. The Lord still delivers the oppressed, restores the broken, and lifts those who feel defeated. Through faith, people can rise above fear, overcome spiritual attacks, and walk in the freedom God intended for their lives. Even those who feel trapped today can experience victory when they place their trust completely in Him. Enemies come in many forms throughout life. Some enemies are visible, while others operate silently in the background. There are people who oppose, betray, and attack with words and actions. There are also spiritual enemies that work through fear, temptation, confusion, discouragement, and hatred. Many believers wonder why opposition increases when they are trying to do what is right. They ask why attacks seem stronger when they are drawing closer to God. The truth is that darkness often resists those who carry the light of faith. But no matter how powerful the enemy appears, God remains greater than every force that rises against His people. In Psalm 1:9, we see the cry of a man under attack. He was surrounded by people who hated him without cause. Lies were spoken against him. Wicked accusations came from every direction. He felt wounded, rejected, and overwhelmed. Yet instead of surrendering to fear or bitterness, he turned to God. That is the difference between defeat and victory. People who rely only on their own strength eventually grow weary. But those who depend on God discover a source of strength that never fails. Many times, enemies attack through words. Negative. Words can pierce the heart deeply. Lies, gossip, criticism, and betrayal can leave wounds that remain for years. Some people have lost confidence because of the words spoken over them. Others have become fearful because someone convinced them they would never succeed. The enemy understands the power of words and often uses them to plant doubt and hopelessness in the mind. But God's truth is stronger than every lie. One word from heaven can destroy years of fear created by human voices. There are also enemies that attack internally. Fear is one of the greatest enemies people face. Fear paralyzes faith and steals peace. It causes people to expect failure before they even try. Some fear the future, while others fear rejection, sickness, loneliness, or loss. The enemy uses fear to make people feel trapped. Yet throughout Scripture, God repeatedly tells His people not to fear because He is with them. Fear grows weaker when faith grows stronger. Temptation is another enemy many people battle daily. The enemy knows human weaknesses and constantly looks for opportunities to pull people away from God's purpose. Temptation promises pleasure while hiding destruction behind it. Some battles happen openly, but many take place silently within the mind and heart. Yet God does not leave his people defenseless. Through prayer, obedience, and faith, believers receive strength to resist temptation and stand firm against spiritual attacks. Some enemies attack through discouragement. They try to convince people that their prayers are useless and their struggles will never end. Discouragement often comes after disappointment or delay. A person may pray for healing, restoration, or breakthrough and become weary when answers do not come quickly. The enemy whispers, "God has forgotten you." But delay does not mean abandonment. God works according to his timing, not human impatience. Even when believers cannot see him moving, he is still working behind the scenes. God defeats enemies in ways people do not always expect. Sometimes he changes circumstances immediately, and other times he changes the person going through the battle. There are moments when God removes the storm, but there are also moments when he strengthens his people to stand in the middle of it. Some victories happen suddenly, while others come through endurance and growth over time. But in every situation, God remains faithful. The greatest victory God gives is not just over human enemies, but over spiritual darkness itself. Through his power, believers can overcome fear, hatred, bitterness, addiction, and despair. The enemy wants people chained to their past, but God offers freedom and restoration. Darkness loses its power when the light of God enters a life fully surrendered to him. Many people fight battles by relying entirely on anger, revenge, or human wisdom. But God calls his people to trust him instead. Bitterness only deepens wounds. Revenge cannot heal the heart. Real victory comes from placing every battle into God's hands. Trusting God does not mean pretending attacks are not painful. It means believing that God is able to bring justice, protection, and peace even in difficult circumstances. There are moments when believers feel surrounded by enemies on every side. Friends may turn away, doors may close, problems may multiply, yet some of God's greatest miracles happen in impossible situations. When people reach the end of their own strength, they begin discovering the greatness of God's power. Battles often reveal how dependent people truly are on him. The enemy may attack, but attacks do not determine the final outcome. God always has the final word. Giants may rise, storms may rage, and darkness may try to spread fear. But the Lord remains undefeated. Those who trust him are never fighting alone. Even in moments of weakness, his strength is enough. Even in seasons of pain, his presence remains near. The same God who delivered his people throughout history still defeats enemies today, and his power has never diminished. There are seasons in life when attacks seem to come from every direction at once. Problems increase, pressure grows heavier, and the heart becomes weary from constant battles. Some people feel attacked emotionally, spiritually, financially, and mentally all at the same time. They wake up exhausted before the day even begins. Fear whispers that they will never overcome what they are facing. The enemy wants believers to become discouraged and give up during difficult seasons. But God has not called his people to collapse under pressure. He has called them to stand strong through faith, even when attacks surround them. In Psalm 109, we see a man facing intense opposition. He was hated, falsely accused, betrayed, and surrounded by people who desired his downfall. Yet despite the attacks, he continued turning toward God. That is one of the greatest lessons believers can learn. Strength is not pretending pain does not exist. Strength, GHT, is choosing to trust God even while the battle continues. Many people think strong faith means never feeling afraid, discouraged, or overwhelmed. But even faithful people experience moments of weakness. Some of the strongest believers in history face seasons of fear and sorrow. The difference is that they refuse to stay defeated. They continued seeking God in the middle of the struggle. Real faith is not the absence of difficulty. Real faith is remaining anchored to God when everything around you feels unstable. One of the enemy's greatest strategies is isolation. When people feel attacked, they often withdraw emotionally and spiritually. They stop praying, stop worshiping, and stop seeking encouragement. The enemy wants believers to feel alone because isolation weakens spiritual strength. But God never intended his people to fight battles disconnected from him. The moment believers begin drawing close to God again, strength begins returning to their hearts. Standing strong. LSO requires guarding the mind. Many battles begin with thoughts. The enemy attacks through fear, lies, doubt, and discouragement. He reminds people of past failures and tries to convince them that future victory is impossible. Some become trapped in endless worry, imagining the worst possible outcome in every situation. But not every thought deserves to be believed. God's truth must become stronger than the enemy's lies. Fear has destroyed the confidence of many people. Fear tells them they are too weak, too broken, or too late to change. It whispers that defeat is unavoidable. But fear loses power when faith rises. Faith reminds believers that God remains greater than every enemy in every circumstance. No attack surprises him. No problem is beyond his ability to handle. Even when believers feel weak, God's strength is still available to them. There are also moments when attacks come through betrayal and rejection. Few things wound the heart more deeply than being hurt by people trusted. Some carry pain from broken friendships, family conflict, or false accusations. Betrayal often creates bitterness, and bitterness can slowly poison the soul. The enemy wants wounded people to remain trapped in anger and resentment, but God calls believers to release bitterness and trust him with justice. Forgiveness does not excuse wrong actions, but it prevents pain from controlling the future. Standing strong during attacks requires persistence in prayer. Prayer is not just a religious habit, it is spiritual warfare. Through prayer, believers place their burdens into God's hands and receive strength for the battle. Prayer shifts focus away from fear and back toward God's power. Some breakthroughs happen quickly, while others require patience and endurance. But every sincere prayer matters before heaven. Worship is another source of strength during attacks. Worship reminds believers of who God is, even when circumstances appear difficult. The enemy wants people focused on problems, but worship lifts the eyes toward the greatness of God. Fear begins shrinking when people remember the faithfulness of the Lord. Throughout history, God has carried his people through impossible situations, and he continues to do so today. Some believers become discouraged because they expect life with God to be free from opposition. But spiritual attacks often increase when people begin growing closer to God. Darkness resists those who walk in faith. Yet attacks are not proof of defeat. Sometimes attacks are evidence that the enemy feels threatened by what God is doing in a person's life. God often uses difficult seasons to strengthen his people. Pressure reveals what is truly inside the heart. Trials teach believers to depend on God in deeper ways. Some of the strongest faith is developed during the hardest battles. While the enemy intends attacks to destroy people, God can use those same battles to build endurance, wisdom, compassion, and spiritual maturity. There will be moments when believers feel tired of fighting. They may wonder if breakthrough will ever come, but God sees every tear, every prayer, and every struggle. He does not abandon his people during seasons of warfare. Even when they cannot see him working, he remains near. His strength becomes greatest in moments of human weakness. Standing strong when feeling attacked does not mean never falling emotionally. It means continuing to rise again through faith. It means refusing to let fear, bitterness, or discouragement have the final word. The enemy may attack fiercely, but God remains faithful. Those who trust him can endure storms, overcome spiritual battles, and continue walking forward with confidence that victory still belongs to the Lord. Victory is something every person longs for. Deep inside the human heart is a desire to overcome pain, defeat fear, break free from bondage, and live with peace. Yet many people spend years feeling trapped in cycles of struggle. They pray for change but continue carrying heavy burdens. They hope for freedom while constantly fighting discouragement and spiritual attacks. The enemy wants people to believe victory is impossible, but God never intended his people to live in permanent defeat. Through faith in him, believers can walk in victory and experience divine protection even in the middle of life's battles. In Psalm 1:9, we see a man surrounded by enemies, betrayal, and false accusations. His situation was painful and overwhelming, yet he continued crying out to God. He understood that true victory does not come from human strength alone. Real victory comes from the Lord. Many people try to fight spiritual battles using only natural solutions, but some struggles require the power of God operating in a person's life. Walking in victory begins with understanding identity. The enemy constantly attacks the minds of believers because he knows confused people become weak people. He tells them they are forgotten, worthless, powerless, and defeated. Some begin believing those lies because of repeated failures or painful experiences. But God sees his people differently. He sees potential where others see weakness. He sees purpose where others see brokenness. Victory begins when believers stop agreeing with the enemy's lies and start trusting God's truth. Fear is one of the greatest obstacles to victory. Fear keeps people trapped in anxiety, hesitation, and doubt. It convinces them to expect defeat before the battle even begins. Some fear the future, while others fear rejection, loss, or failure. But fear loses its power when faith becomes stronger. Faith reminds believers that God is greater than every giant standing before them. Even when circumstances look impossible, nothing is impossible for the Lord. Divine protection does not mean believers will never face difficulties. Throughout Scripture, faithful people still experience storms, opposition, and suffering. But God protected them in the middle of the sea battles. Protection means the enemy cannot destroy what God has chosen to preserve. It means that even when attacks come, believers are never abandoned. God remains near to those who trust him. Many people think victory means the absence of struggle, but often victory is learning how to stand firm while the struggle continues. There are moments when God changes circumstances instantly, and there are moments when he strengthens people to endure until breakthrough comes. Some miracles happen suddenly, while others unfold gradually over time. But in every season, God continues working for the good of those who place their faith in him. Prayer is essential for walking in victory. Prayer connects believers to the strength of heaven. Without prayer, people become spiritually weak and vulnerable to attacks from the enemy. Prayer renews the mind, strengthens faith, and brings peace into troubled hearts. It reminds believers they are not fighting alone. Some battles are won privately on the knees before they are seen publicly in life. The Word of God also strengthens believers against spiritual attacks. The enemy fights with lies, but truth destroys lies. When believers fill their minds with God's promises, fear and discouragement begin losing power. A person who knows God's truth can stand firm even during intense opposition. The storms may rage around them, but their foundation remains secure. Walking in divine protection also requires obedience. Some people want God's blessings while continuing to live far from him, but obedience keeps believers aligned with God's will and guidance. The Lord leads, protects, and strengthens those who trust him enough to follow his direction. Obedience does not make a person perfect, but it keeps the heart surrendered to God. There are times when spiritual attacks become intense. The enemy may use discouragement, temptation, confusion, or conflict to weaken faith. During those moments, believers must remember that attacks do not mean, and God has left them. In fact, some of the greatest attacks come right before major breakthroughs. Darkness often fights hardest against those who are closest to victory. Many people underestimate the importance of perseverance. They pray for victory, but give up too quickly when difficulties continue. Faith requires endurance. It means trusting God even when answers seem delayed. Some victories happen in a moment, while others develop through seasons of waiting and growth. But God honors those who continue believing him despite opposition. Walking in victory also means refusing to live controlled by bitterness and hatred. The enemy wants wounded people trapped in anger because bitterness destroys peace and weakens the spirit. God calls believers to trust him with justice and continue walking forward in faith. Freedom comes when the heart releases resentment and chooses to trust God completely. Divine protection surrounds those who place their confidence in the Lord. Even when enemies rise, God remains greater. Even when storms come, his presence remains steady. The enemy may attack, but he does not determine the final outcome. God always has the final word. No chain is stronger than his power. No darkness can overcome his light. No battle is beyond his ability to bring victory. Those who trust God can walk through difficult seasons without being destroyed by them. They may face opposition, but they will not stand alone. They may endure storms, but the storms will not last forever. The Lord remains faithful to strengthen, guide, and protect his people. Through him, victory is possible, peace is available, and hope remains alive no matter how fierce the battle becomes.